Hey book lovers, want to hear a story? Welcome back to Storytime with Em. This is a mini episode from Em's Books and Cats podcast, where I am sharing my books a chapter a week. Right now I am sharing my oldest book, currently still available for purchase. It is called Do You Remember Ella? And we are on chapter 3. Enjoy. I slipped out of my room and crept down the silent hall. It was surprisingly easy to sneak out of the dorm. I was soon standing outside shivering in my thin t-shirt and pajama pants. I hadn't thought to grab a sweater, and the dark November night was colder than I expected. I moved quietly down the walk, darting in and out of the shadows that spilled onto the pavement. The dull orange lights gave everything an old look, like a sepia photo. I saw Hugo, the new nighttime guard, doing his rounds. He paced in front of the theater building a few times. The front entrance was roped off with yellow caution tape, and no one had been allowed inside all day. Hugo moved away, and I waited until he entered Mueller Hall before sprinting to the theater and darting inside. It was dark, but my eyes slowly adjusted. I knew the building better than my own home, and I moved quietly through the darkness without bumping into anything. The basement was lit by the muted red glow of the exit signs that hung above every doorway. I pushed open the door to the dressing room and turned on the light. The glass still littered the floor, and the words were as bold as before. The glare of the overhead fluorescent lights made everything stark and surreal. In the center of the old cement floor was a spot of red. It looked a bit like spilled paint, but as I watched, it grew. I knew this sight. I had seen it many times before. It grew dark and thick, covered the floor, and ran down the walls. The glass was gone. The words were gone. The entire room was filled with blood. There was a gurgling sound from the bathroom. I stepped slowly into the room and moved through the hot, sticky mess to the showers. The blood was swirling down the drains of both shower stalls and bubbling up out of the sinks. The gurgling grew louder until a geyser of blood rushed up from the floor and rained down on me. I screamed and ran from the room. My foot slipped in the hallway, and I fell to the floor. Inside the dressing room, I could see the glass, and the words had returned. The blood was gone. I woke suddenly and found myself safely in my dorm room. I went to the window and peered out into the orange-tinted gloom. A fog had settled over the campus, and it gave everything an ominous feeling. It was hard to tell dream from reality. I could see the theater building from my window, and I could see the shape of Hugo pacing in front of the entrance. As I sat by the window trying to decide if it was a dream or another ghastly vision, I heard a scraping noise at my door. There was a slight sound of metal on metal, and I thought I saw the lock begin to turn. "Who's there?" I meant to scream and wake the dorm mother, but my voice was soft, almost a whisper. The lock didn't turn. I moved slowly to my door and listened, but I couldn't hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. My body raced with adrenaline, and I placed my hand on the doorknob. I almost screamed as a piece of paper slid under the door. It was bright pink and folded into a neat square. I jumped away from the door, but a moment later, in a sudden rush of bravado, I threw it open and peered down the hall. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe I thought I'd find Ella standing there with her manic grin, but there was no one. The hall was dark except for the light coming from the stairwell. I thought I heard the scuff of a shoe on the stairs, but when I ran to the stairwell and peered down, it was deserted. I went back to my room and checked the lock several times with shaking hands. The neon paper glared up at me, but I couldn't pick it up. I had never feared a piece of paper before, but I couldn't touch it. I couldn't imagine what was written on it or what trouble it would cause me. I sat and watched the door until the sun rose. I was exhausted but dragged myself to the shower. It was better to shower before anyone else woke up, and it was nice to have a little peace. When I returned to my room, I felt better. In the light of morning, my fears seemed silly. I lifted the paper gingerly. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the note. "No fear shall you feel. Their ignorance will be cured. No harm can come to you while I live, by action or by word. For you are a true friend, a true love, the gifted one, and you remember Ella." The handwriting was the same, and the words worried me. They were threatening, yet not directed at me. I read the note several times and then hid it in a folder of old show programs. I tucked the folder behind a large tote of winter clothes in the back of my closet and began to get ready for the day. The mood around the campus that morning was strange. Students stood clumped together outside the dining hall, but no one was talking. Inside, students were staring at their plates. It was too silent. I got into line, and the woman behind the counter was crying as she laid eggs and sausages on my plate. What's going on? Why is everyone acting so weird? The woman just glared at me and told me I was holding up the line. I found an empty table, but I couldn't eat. Everyone was looking at me. Their whispers were a cacophony in the otherwise quiet room. After a few torturous minutes, I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back door. I followed the walkway that passed through a grove of trees behind the building. No one ever used the back walk, and I was surprised to see someone sitting on one of the ornamental benches that lined the path. When I got closer, I saw it was Brando. He was staring blankly at the ground in front of him. I stopped and stood beside him for several minutes, but he didn't notice me. I sat down beside him, and he still didn't notice. Brando? He jumped up as if a gun had gone off beside him. Sophie! What's going on? Why is everyone acting so weird? You haven't heard. Heard about what? Brando grabbed his face and turned away. His shoulders were shaking and a sob escaped him. I couldn't believe he was crying. I just stared at him for a moment. Slowly, I placed my hand on his shoulder. Brando? He spun around, jumped up off the bench, and backed away. His eyes darted around, and I assumed that he didn't want to be seen with me. It would be a serious detriment to his popularity, and I had a feeling that he was always walking a very fine line. Just leave me alone, Sophie. I just want to know what's going on. Can't you tell me? He made a short, rough sound in his throat. It could have been another sob or an attempt at a laugh. I couldn't tell which. He gave me a quick look over his shoulder. His expression was an odd mixture of sadness, anger, and fear. Mr. Franklin's gone. To say that I wasn't partially relieved by this information would be false. But I also had to wonder what this meant for me. I had to assume that everyone would link me to this mystery somehow, and I wasn't sure I could handle the repercussions. Brando was walking away quickly. It was more of a jog, really, but I caught up with him near the science building. When he looked at me, I saw that his eyes were wet. He wiped at them savagely with the sleeve of his jacket and glared at me. Go away, Sophie. Wait, Brando. I just wanted to ask you something. He stopped walking and sighed. What? Have you heard from Ella recently? He looked at me as if something disgusting and vicious was growing out of my head. He opened his mouth to speak, then shook his head and ran away. They called the school assembly to announce Mr. Franklin's disappearance. Everyone already knew, but there was a fresh wave of tears from the students. There were a few other faces that, like mine, wore a more relieved than sorrowful expression. Headmaster Quincy finished his announcement, and the room erupted. Everyone began talking at once, crying and screaming. The sound was incredible. A girl beside me screamed and pulled her perfect brown pigtails. Her friend tried to console her, but she would not stop. Things started to get out of hand. The jocks began shoving people around, and fights broke out all over the auditorium. Some students in the back started throwing chairs, and the faculty hurried off the stage. Some went out the back door, while others tried to break up the fights. Mrs. Miller got punched in the face by one of the hockey players, and I saw two girls trying to choke Headmaster Quincy with his tie. I got out of there as quickly as I could. The stairway echoed with the rage from above, and I ran down the stairs as fast as possible. The tension on campus had been growing since the strange pranks began, and the sound of it boiling over was deafening. I burst through the door and into the hallway, and I ran into Marcus with so much force that we both fell down. He laughed as we tried to untangle our legs, and he wrapped his arms around me. You cannot escape me, Sophie. He laughed again and stood up. He held his hand out to me and helped me to my feet. He didn't let go of my hand, and he remained very close to me. What is going on up there? I don't know. Everyone just lost it. It was crazy. I didn't know Mr. Franklin very well. He seemed all right. I'm sure he was fine to you. As long as you're a jock, he's nice to you. If you're not, well... I broke off and looked away. Marcus was grinning at me, and it made me nervous. The sudden sound of thundering footsteps made us both jump, and Marcus pulled me to the door. Come on, Let's get out of here. It's not safe. We ran out into the first snowstorm of the year. The huge, fluffy flakes made the world look clean and new, and the madness inside seemed to fade away. Marcus brought me to a place in the trees behind the dorms. There was a small cluster of immense oaks. They grew so close together that the branches intertwined and formed seats high up amongst the remaining brittle brown leaves. It was a magical place. We climbed up into the branches and watched the snow fall in silence. Marcus was smiling at me again. This place is kind of wild. Nothing like this has happened before. Really, nothing weird has ever happened here. This seems like a perfect place to hide the freaks and failures. I smiled. Well, that's true. But they usually try to behave like normal people. Marcus leaned back in his seat and stared up at the sky. The snowflakes caught in his eyelashes, shimmered in his gorgeous hair, and melted on his cheek. He laughed at the bright gray sky, and his eyes sparkled. I like you, Sophie. You're different. Thanks, I guess. He leaned in close to me. That's good, Sophie. Different is good. He kissed me on the cheek and jumped down out of the tree. He landed with unbelievable grace, while I fell awkwardly and landed in a heap at his feet. Instead of helping me up, he lay in the snow beside me and held my hand. The air was cold and I shivered. The back of my uniform was soaked and I was freezing. Marcus rolled onto his side and looked at me. Pretty soon this stuff will stop happening. How do you know that? He held out his hand. The snow. Footprints would lead security right to whoever is doing all this. Do you think it was Mr. Franklin? Maybe that's why he took off. You think he left on his own? Sure. His affairs with the students are pretty well known. I bet his wife kicked him out. The school's not going to fight to keep him here. I bet he went somewhere warm, that bastard. He grew somber for a moment and looked down at his hands. His fingers nervously played with a twig that he had plucked from the ground. He glanced at me and looked away quickly. Valeria's gone too. What? I tried to hide the joy that was growing inside me. Marcus had obviously cared about her, and I couldn't express my true feelings without hurting him. But to have two of my main problems at school suddenly vanish was too good to be believed. They left together? He sighed. Yeah, I knew all about them, but I thought it was different with us. She said that she was done with Franklin. She said she loved me. I'm sorry, Marcus. Yeah, well, we should probably go back and make sure they haven't burned the school down or killed each other. He got up and helped me stand. We brushed snow from each other's backs and started back to the academic buildings. There were students standing in clumps all over campus. Most of them had gathered outside the dining hall, though lunch would not be served for another hour. No one said anything. Several students had broken arms or black eyes. I saw Brando sitting near the door of the dining hall. His lip was split, and drops of blood lay vibrant against the snow surrounding him. I saw him look at us, and his eyes were murderous. I stopped walking, but Marcus took my hand and gently pulled me forward. We joined Brando and sat in the snow beside him. You okay, man? Brando nodded. Yeah, just sucks, you know? Mr. Franklin was like a father to me. I had no idea he was... He looked quickly at Marcus's sullen face and mumbled an apology, but Marcus just shook his head. It's all right, man. Everyone tried to warn me. I couldn't believe this was all happening. Marcus was sitting close to me, and his fingers lightly touched mine. There was an intense sadness all around me, but I felt nothing but relief. I was free from torment and persecution by two people that had been cruel to me since the first day I came to Cullen Academy. I felt unbelievably free. There was a ripple of sound as the headmaster came down the walk. The sleeve of his coat was torn, and his arm was bandaged. 3 long red scratches ran down his cheek. He looked like he had been in a fight with a wild animal. Joe Blood and several of the larger male teachers surrounded him. They eyed the students as they passed, and looked ready to pounce at the slightest hint of rebellion. Our eyes met. He halted in the middle of the walk and motioned for me to come with him. Every eye turned to me, and I felt my face growing hot again. I hated blushing. It happened automatically, and it made me so angry. It always made me look guilty when I was really just shy. I approached him slowly. It was difficult to move under the heaviness of all those stares. My feet felt like they each weighed 100 pounds. I was allowed inside the tight knot of teachers, and we returned to the main building. The halls had been torn apart. Books were torn and scattered everywhere, and the glass surrounding the offices had been smashed. Every window in the offices was now a gaping mouth filled with sharp, glittering teeth. Headmaster Quincy brushed glass and torn papers off of a chair, and I sat down. He sat across from me, swept the debris from his desk, and leaned forward. He placed his hands palm to palm and looked at me over his fingertips. One of the lenses in his glasses was cracked, and they sat askew on his nose. "Sophie, you don't know anything about Mr. Franklin's disappearance?" "No, sir." "Nothing at all." "I've only heard the rumors, sir, just like everybody else." "Well, everybody else isn't talking. What does the rumor mill say about all this?" "That they were having an affair and ran off together. It's just a rumor." Headmaster Quincy sighed and massaged his temples. "That's what I was afraid of. This isn't going to look good for the school at all. We're sure to lose some of our benefactors over this. How could I have not seen it?" He dismissed me with a wave before he buried his face in his hands. Once I was out in the hall, I saw Brando moving toward me very quickly. The expression on his face was terrifying. I turned away and started to run, but he caught me easily and spun me around. His face was pale and his eyes were red from crying. He was breathing heavily, and his fingers dug sharply into my arm. "What did you do to them?" "Brando, calm down. I didn't do anything to anyone." "Am I next? You have to tell me. Am I?" "What? No. Next for what?" He shot me one last wild look before he pushed me away and ran down the hall. I was about to go after him when Marcus appeared at my side. "Are you okay?" He held my arm lightly, and his face was concerned. "I'm fine." "Want to go for another walk?" "No, I think I need to lay down. I'm sorry. I need to be alone for a little while." Marcus smiled and nodded slightly. He walked me to my dorm, and when the door closed behind me, I was overcome with emotions. I dropped to the floor and curled into a ball. I cried until I couldn't breathe. I stayed in my room all day. From my window, I watched the small knots of students that dotted the snow-covered lawn. The snow kept falling, but most of them remained out there the whole day. Occasionally, a few would leave, and others would take their place. I tried not to think about anything. The relief I felt was overshadowed by guilt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Franklin and Valeria had not run away together. The pink letter bothered me. I couldn't put it out of my mind, and the words seemed so much more sinister now. At 8 they rang the bells. The sound thundered down from the bell tower and echoed around the hills of the campus. A long procession of students came down the walk. They held candles and moved slowly. Even from far away, I could see they were crying. Brando was at the end of the long line, and I was startled to see him staring up at my window. I went downstairs and quietly joined them. They walked through the campus to the hockey rink. No one spoke, and the silence was eerie. The hockey rink was filling up quickly, but still no one made a sound. An occasional muffled sob would escape, but nothing more. I knew I'd made a mistake as soon as I stepped inside. Many of the students were watching me with open hatred on their faces. Brando was standing near the door, and he grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. "What's wrong, Sophie? Stay a while." His voice cut through the silence, and many of the students laughed as he pulled me onto the ice. I slipped and fell, and Brando laughed. I didn't try to get up, and he used his foot to push me to the center of the ice. The other kids laughed and cheered and screamed obscene remarks. I tried to crawl away, but Brando grabbed my foot and sent my face smashing into the rink. I bit my lip, and blood dripped onto the ice. The crowd cheered at the sight of it. Brando's eyes were dark and wild, and he laughed like a maniac while they cheered. He bent down close and grabbed my hair. He pulled my head up and whispered in my ear, "Am I next?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." He slammed my face into the ice, and the crowd roared. Lights danced around the edges of my vision. Every movement sent a sharp pain through my head. "Stop this. Stop it now." Headmaster Quincy shoved his way through the crowd and out onto the ice. Joe Blood was close behind him. "Everyone back to your rooms immediately. There will be dorm meetings in 1 hour, and everyone will attend. The police have been called, and any who remain will be arrested. Your parents will be notified." The crowd broke up and the students moved slowly toward the door. Headmaster Quincy wouldn't let me stand. "We'll bring you to the nurse." "I'm okay, Headmaster Quincy. I just need to go lie down." "No, you're going to the nurse. If you have a concussion, the worst thing you can do is lie down." There was no arguing with him, and I reluctantly let him lead me to the nurse's office. Mrs. Jennings was a stern, unsmiling woman with large hips and an unfriendly demeanor. She poked at my injuries and determined that I was fine. She bandaged my lip and sent me back to the dorm. Headmaster Quincy had already left to deal with the emergency dorm meetings, and I had to walk back alone. The campus was dark, and it took me a moment to realize that most of the lamps had been smashed. A movement next to the building startled me, and I screamed. Marcus grabbed my arm and clamped his hand over my mouth. "Shh, it's okay. No one is going to hurt you again. I promise I'll protect you." His smile gleamed in the moonlight, and I leaned back against the arm he placed around me. "I don't want to go back to the dorm. I can't sit through that meeting." "You shouldn't have to. Let's go for a walk. The moon's bright enough to see the way." We started up the road that ran past the athletic fields. The football field looked peaceful under a blanket of white. Marcus slipped his jacket over my shoulders, and I smiled up at him. It was cold, but I didn't mind. Being away from campus was enough for me at that moment. There were footprints in the snow. They were almost filled in, but there was a vague outline. They turned off the road and went into the forest. Marcus didn't notice them. Then he put his arm firmly around me, and I forgot all about them. We turned onto a path that led up to the old farmhouse and began climbing up the slippery hill. Marcus helped me over a newly fallen branch that blocked the old trail. "We're going to the farmhouse?" Marcus smiled. "No one will find us out there." I hesitated, but his confident smile and the strong arm around my shoulders convinced me to keep going. The house was even more menacing in the moonlight. Marcus ran up the front steps and onto the porch, nimbly avoiding the gaping holes in the floorboards. I stopped and looked up at him. Something about his face seemed different and terrifying in the darkness. I thought I saw a strange, almost sinister look on his face, but it was gone a moment later. "Come inside. It might be a little warmer." "I don't want to go in." "It's all right. Nothing in there can hurt you. Besides," he said with a warm smile, "I'm here to protect you." I stepped carefully onto the porch. Fear was growing in the pit of my stomach. Memories of my first visit with Ella came back in vivid detail. I looked down and saw a bright red trail leading to the doorway. I looked away, and when I looked down again, it was gone. Marcus held the front door open for me, and I took a deep breath and stepped into the dark room. Marcus produced a candle from his pocket, and the room was immediately populated with dancing shadows. We stepped carefully through the kitchen and into the living room. I turned back again and glimpsed the dark, shiny trail that led from the doorway to the stairs. The dark blood pooled on the landing, and smears of it stained the steps. Marcus didn't see any of it, and when he sat on the steps just below the landing, I screamed. He jumped to his feet and was at my side in seconds. "What's wrong?" I couldn't answer. My heart raced, and I couldn't control my breathing. He pulled me close and held me until my breathing finally slowed. He stroked my hair, and I fought the urge to run from the house. When he released me, the blood was gone. I started to cry. "Sophie, what's wrong?" I shook my head. "I think I'm losing my mind." He smiled and gently smoothed my hair. "You're fine. Everything is going to be okay. Do you believe me?" I nodded, and he smiled. He led me out of the house. As we walked back through the deepening snow, Marcus took my hand and gave me an apologetic smile. "This was a bad idea. I'm sorry. I thought it would help to get away from everyone." "It did help. Thank you. I'm sorry I freaked out up there. I just got a little spooked." He kissed my forehead, and we finished our walk in silence. The campus was brightly lit when we returned. The broken lamps had been speedily replaced. We saw Joe Blood on our way back to the dorms. Joe was a massive man with broad shoulders and arms like tree trunks. He stopped us outside my dorm, and he was angry. "Where have you been?" "We went for a walk. I needed to get away for a little while." "The entire security team has been out searching for you. We thought you had run away or been kidnapped. You're not safe here, Sophie. Headmaster Quincy has found a new room for you until we get everything under control. Follow me." Marcus started to follow as well, but Joe stopped him. "Not you. You go back to your room and keep a low profile. You haven't seen Sophie since the incident. You understand?" "Where's she going?" Marcus was angry and stood with his face just inches from Joe's. He clenched his hands into fists and looked ready to fight if Joe suddenly turned violent. My heart pounded in my ears. I'd never had anyone protect me, and it was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Joe didn't fight Marcus. He sighed, and his face looked old and tired, though he couldn't have been more than 35. "No one's allowed to know where she's staying. This will all blow over in a day or two. They found a letter from Mr. Franklin, and it seems he was having an affair with the girl, and they ran away together. Mrs. Franklin's a mess." For a fleeting moment, I saw the sadness in Marcus's eyes. He had truly cared for Valeria. I didn't like thinking about it, but I knew that he was suffering. I followed Joe slowly and kept looking back to see if Marcus would look back at me. He didn't. He stared at the ground in front of him, while the snow collected in his golden hair. Joe told me to hurry up, and I ran after him. He led me to an old dorm that was used to house visiting teachers and alumni. Headmaster Quincy was waiting for me in the living room. He was staring at the fireplace and jumped when the door slammed shut behind me. I turned and saw that Joe had remained outside. Headmaster Quincy gave me a weak smile and adjusted his glasses. "Sophie, they found you. I'm glad to see you are safe. In all my years as headmaster, I have never seen such violence. It's surreal." It felt pretty real to me. That seemed to bring him back, and he gave me a serious look. "You cannot run off like that again, Sophie. It's not safe. Stay here and let us protect you. This will all blow over in a few days. The students blamed you for Mr. Franklin's disappearance, but I have just received a letter from him." He reached into his pocket. "It seems that the rumor mill was correct. Mr. Franklin has been having an affair with a student and decided to leave his wife. Normally I would not share this with the students, but I think that under the circumstances it is necessary." He pulled the letter out of his pocket. It was bright blue. And that is the end of Chapter 3 of Do You Remember Ella, one of the first books I ever wrote, and I hope you are enjoying it so far. Have a beautiful week, book lovers. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep reading.